The financial crisis that now has engulfed the entire world claimed as one of its first victims idyllic Iceland, with a population of just 300,000 people. In many ways, Iceland's unlikely story captures the essence of what has gone wrong with the global financial system. Funded by cheap foreign money, Iceland's banks expanded dramatically, quickly eclipsing more traditional industries, such as fishing and tourism. When the credit crunch started biting, the highly leveraged banks were hit hard.
Iceland allowed a very oversized banking system to develop, a banking system that significantly outstripped the authorities' ability to act as a lender of last resort when the system ran into trouble. Only a few years ago, they had a banking system that was for normal size. They privatized 3 banks, and these 3 banks went rapidly from having assets of slightly more than 100% of GDP to close to 1,000% of GDP. When confidence started weakening, Iceland was one of the first victims because markets started realizing that this was a banking system that was far too big relative to the size of the economy. As confidence weakened, it quickly spilled over into trouble for the Icelandic krona, and within a week the 3 banks collapsed and the foreign exchange market essentially collapsed.
So what will be the effects of this banking crisis?
Essentially that Iceland have gone overnight from being one of the lowest indebted countries in Europe to be among the highest indebted countries in Europe.
Initially, Iceland sought to deal with the crisis on its own, but it soon turned to the IMF for help, and a rescue package totaling $2.1 billion was announced. What made Iceland turn to the IMF?
This banking crisis in Iceland is of historic proportions. So I think it was pretty natural to turn to the IMF and the world community for advice and to borrow some money.
Since the IMF program was announced, stability is slowly returning, but the situation is still very volatile. So what is Iceland's government hoping to achieve working with the IMF?
Iceland is still a highly leveraged economy. Much of the debt is denominated in foreign exchange or indexed to inflation. That means as the krona depreciates, debt servicing becomes so much more expensive. There's a big risk that if we don't stop the decline of the krona, a wave of defaults in the corporate and household sectors, and that the key objective in the short run is to stabilize the krona.
I do think it was the right thing by the Icelandic Central Bank to raise interest rates. Basically, you have a currency that lost a lot of confidence, and you need to bolster confidence.
Iceland's GDP is expected to drop by 10% next year, which sounds dramatic. But what would have happened if the IMF had not stepped in?
The alternative would have been, I am convinced, significant strain on households that have their mortgages fixed in foreign exchange, on the corporate sector that has loans fixed in foreign exchange, a lot of defaults, much higher increase in unemployment, a reduction in GDP much higher than minus 10%.
If you would not have had the help from the IMF, it would have been tougher.
Sweden experienced a similar banking crisis in the 1990s, and the country's handling of that crisis is now being held up as a model for others to follow. How does the IMF's policy advice match up with the Swedish experience?
If you compare it with the Swedish banking crisis we had in the 90s, there are similarities, but there are also differences. One similarity is, of course, that it's a banking crisis. But one difference is that the Swedish banking crisis took place in an international environment that was a bit better than the present one. And the other thing was that Swedish banks did not have as large external debt as the Icelanders do. The other thing was that Swedish banks were a more domestic problem, but here it's a large, they have sort of given out a lot of loans outside Iceland, and that creates other problems.
The hope is that these measures will help restore confidence in Iceland's economy. But the fallout from the crisis is likely to reverberate for years, and it is already prompting Iceland to rethink its place in the world.
The next coming years will be tough for the whole of Iceland, for the people living there and for the government, and I do not envy them because it's tough. But if they take the right decisions now, they have a great future.
There's no doubt that Iceland is going to face a couple of years of hardship. This is a dramatic shock, I mean an unprecedented shock. It's probably going to be the most expensive bank restructuring that the world has ever seen relative to the size of the economy. So I do expect after this relatively sharp downturn that the economy could rebound fairly fast.